Awesome. So yeah, let's get right into it. So again, hello. Today, Claire and I wanted to talk about money and more precisely how we advise you to go about to go after the salary that you deserve. Um, so here's a little overview of what we'll go through. We basically divided up the topic in three parts. The first one is going to be by Claire, and it's about how you should negotiate your salary during a hiring process. Then I'm going to talk about how you can renegotiate your salary with your current employer. And finally, we'll go into how to figure out how much you should be asking for it. Um, so awesome. Before we get into it, we wanted to quickly talk about why we chose this topic and introduce ourselves a little bit. So I wanted to put this number here. I'm sure it doesn't come as a surprise to most of us, but it's still important to be conscious of it. There's still a very important gap between what men and women get paid, and that number is specific to the tech industry. So even in such a modern industry, it still exists. And it's something that Claire and I have been dealing with quite a bit, given our respective roles in HR and recruitment. And hopefully we can make a little dent in that gap today with this presentation. So I wanted to start by quickly introducing ourselves. So for my part, I'm Sarah. I started out in the tech industry about 7 years ago. When I joined Unito, that was 4 years ago. We're, by the way, a SaaS company based in Montreal, if you didn't know us. So I first started out on the operations side. I was doing a bit of everything, and as the company and my team grew, I decided to focus more and more on the HR front. Because I saw how much impact I could have on the company by helping create a really cool workplace and a really cool team. And so now I'm in charge of things like building our compensation philosophy and ensuring that people have good growth path at Unito, which are all very important things to ensure pay equity in the company. And so now I'm going to let Claire introduce herself and continue the presentation with the first portion, which is negotiating salary during a hiring process.
So, hi everyone, I'm Claire. I guess you can hear from my French accent, I come from France. I've been a recruiter for the past 10 years. I love finding the right people for Unito, but also helping candidates find the perfect fit for the next job. So, one of the things I find super rewarding in my job as a recruiter is that I get to help candidates navigate the job search, and I coach them to make sure that they find the right best opportunity as possible. At Unito, but sometimes outside from Unito because there are other companies that are a better match for them. So in the first part, I would like to talk about when you should negotiate and how you should negotiate your salary when you interview. So it's going to be mostly some tips to take into account if you want, if they are relevant. You'll see at the end of it. So first of all, when do you think you should start talking about salary during a hiring process? For me, it's really at the beginning of the process. It's something that you should really, really keep in mind. But before starting to talk about it, you should first of all, before starting a process, to think about what drives you in your day-to-day and what motivates you, because it's sometimes more important than the salary itself. So there are a few criteria you can consider when it comes to your own perspective of what is the best next job for you. Sometimes it's salary, sometimes it's a company culture. So before even starting a job search, you can really look at what are the criteria for you, because it's easy to forget what your priorities are when you're trying to sell your skills in an interview process. So taking the highest salary you get offered is very tempting, but it's not always the best option. So 2 quick tips, like make sure that your criteria are clear in your mind before starting your job search, but also ask questions and do your research to vet the company on your top criteria. It's really going to help you. Another thing you should consider before starting a hiring process is really doing a research about how much you think you are worth and what are the salary expectations you should be asking for. And Sarah is going to talk about it later on. So yes, as I was mentioning before, you should start talking about salary super early on. So it's going to help you, but also the company to save time. So during the first interview or the first phone screen, if the person does not mention it, don't hesitate to ask for it. Another tip that I would like to give you is to talk about salary expectations and not about what you're currently making, to avoid the company offering you the same thing or just a small bump in salary. When you change jobs, the average is a bump of 15%. So you should think about this. Of course, do your research before, because you may already be paid super well. So make sure that you ask for a fair market rate. Another tip I'd like to share with you, which is a bit obvious, but I think it's important to keep it in mind, is really to practice what you're going to ask, to be able to explain to the person in front of you that you're prepared and that you know that what you're worth with really a good confidence. And the last one is a bit easy as well. It's really important to keep the door open. Sometimes candidates, they can look very junior on paper, but they turn out to be much more skilled than we initially thought. And for instance, I met a software developer just a few weeks back, and she had about 2 years of experience, and I thought that she would be junior or intermediate, but after talking with her and once she completed the whole hiring process, we realized that she was much closer to our senior developer standards. So we readjusted the offer to make sure that it was fair. So be flexible if you really like the opportunity, to also avoid ending up a process too early because of salary. The company should be able to assess you more effectively at the end of the hiring process, because they will have seen a bit more in details what you can do, and they may reconsider this initial salary when they know what you can do. Another place where you can negotiate the salary is really at the offer stage. So when you get an offer, if you're excited about the offer and about the opportunity, don't hesitate to tell it to the people making the offer. And also ask for feedback on how well you did during the hiring process. It's going to give you also some insights on how the company is able to assess you, and help you also negotiate later on at the offer stage what you should ask for. If the offer is below the expectations you gave, like remind them. It's super important to let them know that you're disappointed about the offer. You can see a little text on how you could negotiate, but a simple way would be to say, I'm a bit disappointed with the number you shared as it's below my expectations. I did a lot of research before interviewing, and I'm confident that the number I gave you initially is more in line with the market. I'm waiting on a few other offers, so I'll take the time to think about it and get back to you. You can give like a timeline, like usually I would say 48 hours between a week, depending on your own other hiring processes. And you can also like thank them for the time they spent in the process, and remind them that you're still considering them, but that you'd like to really like take the time to think about it. Sometimes the offer simply fits your expectations, and that's great. You should still ask for time to think about it anyway, because I think it's a good way for you to take some time to go back to your list of criteria and make sure that you're taking the right decision before saying yes. Of course, I'm a recruiter, and what I love is when candidates answer right away during the call. But do this only if you're 100% sure that it's the right move and that's the right offer. Another tip would be to try to get several offers. It will help you in the negotiation process. You can go back to the company you like the most with the highest offer you got and see if they can match it. And you can also set up your own timeline to get some offers and make sure that you are able to be honest and transparent with other companies about what are the ongoing processes and um, what's your timeline. I think they can really adapt. We are in a really competitive market. So if a company really wants you, they'll be able to wait a few days or a few weeks, even sometimes, to get you in their team. Sometimes there is no room for negotiation. And in that case, if it's really the company you'd like to join, like make sure that when you join them, after a few months, once you're onboarded, you should ask a re-evaluation after 6 months, to be sure that you show them how you work, you show them what you're worth, make sure that you take the time to ask them some re-evaluation to be sure that you're paid in a fair way. That was it for when you should negotiate. I'm going to pass it over to Sarah, who is going to give you some more insights on when you should continue to negotiate.
Cool. So yeah, at this point, hopefully you're at a stage where you have a job that you love and that pays you a fair salary. But unfortunately, the work has just begun and you still need to keep going with the negotiation process. So renegotiating your salary with your current employer is often a much more stressful conversation than doing it during a hiring process. So make sure you're extra prepared for that one. And hopefully today I can give you a few tips that will help you get through it. So the first one I want to give you is to really know the timeline. It's important to gain a really good understanding of how your company manages salary increases, performance, and promotions early on. I actually recommend that you ask about this during the hiring process, if possible, and then confirm it with your manager once you've started the job. The second tip here is to build a growth path very early on with your manager. So once you've onboarded and started performing well, typically around the 6-month mark, same thing as Claire said, I recommend you start a growth conversation with your manager at that point. The main reason is you don't want to let the first kind of growth conversation that you have with your manager to be about salary. So don't wait for that like yearly review process. Anticipate that conversation by talking about something else than salary, and instead setting really clear goals for your progression in the company. And clear goals is really the key word here. Don't be satisfied with an answer like, well, if your performance review is good, then we'll consider you for promotion or bonus. Ask for really concrete things that you can work towards so that you know exactly how you can show your progression to your manager. Another tip that you've probably heard before, it's to get offers from other companies. This is a pretty bold move, but it works. It tends to be very uncomfortable for both you and your employer, so I only recommend doing this if the negotiation process with your current employer isn't going well, but you'd still like to stay at the company because you enjoy it. So for example, if you got told no several times, when asking for a salary increase, or if you haven't had any increase in over 2 years, that's when I'd consider doing that kind of move. And it's pretty much the same thing as when you're interviewing and getting several offers. You want to go get a few offers, or maybe just one other could be enough. Even better if you have several. And choose a company that you like best. Maybe it turns out it's not the one that you're currently at after all. And then have that company match the highest offer that you got. Finally, and it kind of goes with it, I think it's really important to continuously reassess those kind of top criteria that Claire talked about. It's so easy to stay at a job or a company that doesn't fulfill you, maybe doesn't pay you well, but also that like doesn't motivate you. So make sure you do that exercise regularly. I'd say on a yearly basis is a good timeline. You could do that with your New Year's resolution. And if you find out by going through that process that you really love the company, but not necessarily the role or the team that you're in, talk about it with your employer or with your HR person, if you trust them. See if there are opportunities to move internally. And if you do that exercise and find that none of your criteria is matched, it's probably time to start interviewing again. So don't put that off for too long. That's it for the main tips. In terms of getting into the salary conversation itself, again, come prepared, show that you've achieved the goals that you set with your manager in your whole growth plan. Have some proof, have some examples of the projects that you've done that have demonstrated the skills that you needed to acquire. Do your research in terms of how much you should be making. We're going to get into it right after this. And in terms of how you can get the topic on the table if there's no clear process, or how you can kind of bring about your own expectations during the conversation. You can just go back a few slides and pretty much do the same thing as you would do during an offer call when you're interviewing. Cool. So now you've got all the tips to kind of negotiate your salary at different stages in your career, but all that kind of is a little bit useless if you actually have no idea how much you should be asking for. So now we're going to get into this, and I'm going to give you a few pointers on researching which salary to ask for. So before we get into the research and the numbers themselves, I wanted to first give you a quick overview of what usually drives salaries. It's really important to understand how they work when you're going to get into a research. So basically, each job has a fair market rate attached to it. It's an offer and demand process usually. And there are like kind of key drivers that are going to drive that rate. I've listed them here, and I want to highlight like two of them that are often forgotten by candidates. The first one is the location. So especially post-pandemic, there's a lot of like American companies that are looking for candidates everywhere in the world for remote jobs. So if, for example, you're interviewing for a company based in Silicon Valley, they don't all adjust salaries for location, and they might be willing to pay you a Silicon Valley rate. So in those cases, you can ask for a crazy salary. If you're interviewing for Montreal-based companies, you have to know what the local rate is, and it is much lower than what you would get in Silicon Valley. Same thing for if you go to Quebec City, for example, it's usually slightly lower than Montreal. If you go to Toronto, it's usually slightly higher than Montreal. All this is changing very fast, but it's important to know that location plays a role. Another thing that people often forget about is company stage. Like the very basic of it is that early stage startups kind of tend to pay lower salaries, whereas like big corporations tend to have more budgets and pay higher salaries. So take that into account when you consider an offer. Glassdoor is a really good place to go. We'll talk about it a bit later to see about specific companies and kind of what their market rate is. And if you're getting an offer from a really early stage company that's a little bit below market, you definitely still want to try and negotiate the salary, but then you can also kind of shift the negotiation towards getting bigger stock option grants to compensate for that. Another important thing to understand is how companies usually raise the salaries of their employees. So I've listed 3 things that are commonly considered when raising salaries. There's usually a yearly review process, but then each company works differently with all this, and they're going to have their own schedule and their own drivers for the way they raise salaries. So again, make sure you ask that of your future employer and your current employer. Make sure you know what their process is. Make sure you're comfortable with the methodology around salaries. You'll see that a lot of them don't really have any, and that could be okay for you if you're comfortable in that, but just check to make sure that it's a great place for you and that you understand how it works so you know how to negotiate after that. Cool. So now that you understand how salaries usually work, it's time to do your research. Like Claire said, you want to do that before starting a hiring process, and you want to do that before going into a salary discussion with your employer. So a very common way to go about doing your research is to go through those online platforms that collect salary data. It's kind of crowdsourced. You usually have to participate in order to access the data, and it's usually free. I definitely recommend doing that. It's a great source of information. A little tip from me, because I kind of bathe in salaries all day long, is that I often find that these platforms are going to give you rates that are lower than what the market currently pays, actually. So don't hesitate to ask for a little bit more than what you see on there. And again, don't forget to take into consideration things like location and company stage when you do that research. Second thing that I recommend doing, and you've heard that before, it's not a big surprise, is to ask around. Ask other people how much they make. I know it's a super hard and uncomfortable thing to do, but you should still do it. I think we really need to all work to break that taboo around what each of us make. I think that's how we'll kind of make some really big moves toward pay equity. But yeah, this is awkward. So here are a few tips that hopefully will help you go about it. First thing is kind of always like introducing that conversation can be awkward. So just start by saying that you're currently interviewing or that you have a performance review coming up. And so you're looking for people to help you figure out how much you should be asking for. If you find a way to ask your colleagues, which if there's no transparency in your company can be tough to do, maybe a thing that you could do to make that easier is to reach out to someone that's in the same role as you, but not at the same seniority level. So ask someone who's slightly more senior than you. That way the expectation that you should be making the same thing isn't there, and it makes it less awkward. And it will give you a sense of what salary you should be aiming for as you get to that level of seniority. Another tip could be to ask people for a ballpark instead of like very precise numbers. I find that it often makes them more comfortable giving numbers if you ask for a ballpark. In terms of who you could be asking outside of like your direct network, you could ask for people who graduated same time as you, in the same field, and that still work in the same field as you. That's usually going to give you a good sense of how much you could be asking for, how much other people make. And another tip, if you don't have any HR recruiters in your network, like I've written here, like you probably know, like Claire and I, we often like know more than the average person on rates for different jobs. So one thing you could do if you don't have any of them in your network is to go back to a recruiter that interviewed you for a job, even if the process didn't work, even if you end up getting the job or even an offer. If you had a good contact with that recruiter, go back to them, try asking them like, hey, I'm looking for your advice. How much do you think I should be asking for? I know that as a recruiter, you have a really good idea of like the current salaries in the market. So yeah, that could be a great way to get some numbers that you can really trust. Cool. So I didn't want to leave you just with like tips and methodology around doing research. So here are some very concrete data points for you to base your research off of. These are mostly focused on developer salaries. So I'm sorry if you're not a developer, but hopefully that still kind of helps you a little bit. So you can see the table at the bottom right contains the actual salaries that we pay our devs currently at Unito. So it's full transparency here. We're sharing the salaries with you. You're going to understand why in a few. But yeah, note that these are, again, specific to our location, industry, stage, etc. So we are post-Series A company based in Montreal in the tech industry. So basically understand that salaries could be higher or lower depending on which companies you're considering working for, already working for. Another thing is, I'm going to talk about the fact that salaries are increasing really fast. So we're actually about to update those salaries, so they won't stay true for much longer. But if you work at a similar company to Unito, it's still like a really good benchmark for you to consider. So one very interesting data point, if you look at the top right table, is that for the past 6 months, salaries have actually been increasing twice as fast as they usually do. It's really crazy right now. It's the whole post-COVID movement. So if you're already working and have an employer currently, now is a really good time to ask for a big salary increase. They hopefully will be giving that proactively, but if they're not, feel comfortable asking. What it also means is that when you do your research for which salaries you should be asking for, make sure you look at the most recent data possible, because things are changing really fast these days. So finally, I've also highlighted here how much a dev on average can expect the worth of their skill set to increase per year on average. It's not like super different when you go from role to role, but devs do tend to increase in salary faster than other roles. So a little disclaimer, I'm not saying that you should necessarily go and ask for a 10% increase every year. Most companies would not give that. But it's a good information to you to have when you do get into a promotion conversation or you switch jobs. This kind of gives you a quick idea of where you should, like what kind of salary increase you should be asking for. So there you go. Hopefully that helps. Do make sure you do research on top of this. Don't just take those numbers and go out for offers. But I hope these numbers give you a good sense of where you stand. I'm going to give it away to Claire now to kind of wrap this up.
So that's it. You have all our tips now. And I hope they will help you in your job search, current roles, to get a raise and be paid what you are worth, because it's super important. There is just one last thing we want to talk about is you should know that if you ever apply to come and work with us at Unito, you can throw all of it through the windows because we do it a bit differently. And I'm going to get into it quickly. First of all, we think that relying on our candidates to be great negotiators is not a good way to ensure that we have a pay equity. So instead, we believe this is the responsibility of the employer. So at Unito, we've built a whole series of process and tools to ensure that we pay our people fairly, regardless of their research or negotiation skills. The first thing that we have at Unito is pay transparency, and that's why Sarah was comfortable sharing it with you earlier on. All our salaries are transparent, so if you join us, you'll know about everyone's salary and everyone will know your salary. So there are no secret negotiations and every salary has to be justifiable. You even know the one of our CEO and exec. It's really something which is part from the beginning of the foundation of Unito. It was already the case. Another thing that really help us to pay people in a fair way is that during our hiring process, we have something called the pilot project. So it's a part of our process where we ask candidates to work with us on a real project. It's not a theoretical test, it's really something that's going to be a benefit for the company. And this is a good way for us to see and to make sure that when we evaluate someone, we are sure of the level and the offer that we make. And it's also a good way to assess candidates on both the hard skills, but also the soft skills, and in a real context or as close to reality context. So we pay candidates for all the time they invest in that because it's important for us to reward their time and their effort in the hiring process. But it's also a two-sided process. It's a great opportunity for our candidates to really fully evaluate us and make sure that we match their criteria when it comes to what they are looking for. Salary is one thing, but there are lots of other things, company culture, and so on can be assessed for them during the pilot project. Another thing we do is that we adjust the unfair market rates. So it's super important for us to be fair. So for the past 2 years, what we've been doing is that we've been adjusting the salaries of the roles which are traditionally dominated by women to fight against one of the causes of the gender pay gap. So it's the fact that some skills are perceived as women's skills and they are usually undervalued. So for instance, we have like admin and HR roles, which can be less paid because it's generally dominated by women with some women skills, which is awful to hear. So that's why we try to adjust this. Another thing is that we reassess all our data and all our salaries super often to make sure that we match the market, generally speaking. And then something which is super helpful and important for us is the growth of every employee at Unito, because if they don't grow at Unito, they'll go elsewhere. The market is crazy. So every person joining Unito gets to build a clear career and growth plan with their manager. So we remove the mystery around what you need to accomplish to get a promotion. Once you're ready, no need to wait for a yearly performance review. Every quarter, we will consider who in which team is ready to get to the next level and why. And if they're not ready, what we can do to really help them with specific action to get to that next level. All of this allows us to remove the whole negotiation piece of our processes because everything is built in and transparent, so it ensures that everyone is paid fairly at the recruitment process, but also later on throughout their whole career at Unito. So that's it for today. I don't know if you have any questions. I saw that there were a few of them already in the Q&A, so we're going to take the time to answer them. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being here. It's a topic that's really, really important for us, so we're happy to address it with you today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah and Claire. I think we had a lot of valuable tips, but I do believe we're getting a share amount of questions as well. So if anyone wants to get off mute and ask the questions directly, please just raise your hand. And in the meantime, we're going to go through the Q&A and just go over the questions as they came.
I can maybe take the first question, which was asked by Marie-Philippe. Thank you for asking it. So on what advice on how to answer to a recruiter when we ask from scratch the salary, I would say make sure that you've got your criteria ready and that you're ready to answer this question even before going on the call. I think you should answer really what you think you're worth. And by this, you have done your research before with Sarah's advice. But also remind them like that the door is open, I think, if it's a place you really want to join. And also share with the recruiters the other criteria, because it's going to really, usually the recruiters, they ask the question, because then they can also pitch you the company the right way, going one by one into your criteria. So for instance, if I have a candidate which tells me, oh, I'm expecting this salary, and then I'm also expecting to have a great company culture, I can share with them like what we have in terms of culture at Unito, but also like give them some really concrete examples. So it's also a good way when you start the salary discussion to start the other discussions and see how we can match your criteria. I don't know if it helps. Don't hesitate to let me know if it's not helpful or if it's not answering the whole question. I think the second question by Gemma was covered. It was, I feel sometimes it's hard to really know if you ask for the right salary, what's your take on talking about salaries with your colleagues? It was mostly covered by Sarah. It's a bit of an awkward question, but setting up some trust between your coworkers and making sure you address it the right way is super important and will help you. And if you're not comfortable doing it internally, there are lots of different options that Sarah shared, like asking some people in the same industry in other companies or even recruiters. Really don't hesitate to ask to other people if you're not at ease asking to your colleagues.
If you don't mind, I would like to do a follow-up on this question. So say we have transparency and we're comfortable discussing our salaries with our colleagues. And I realize, I'm paid 20% less than the same person in the same, someone else in the same position. What's next? Because just going and saying, oh, I think it's unfair if it's the salary that I asked for seemed like a very complicated conversation, because I said, this is all theoretical again, but I accepted an offer and now I'm like, oh, I don't like it anymore. So how do you have this conversation?
I can take that one. So what I recommend doing first is give your employee the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they don't deserve it, but just like kind of letting them know that you're not accusing them of unfair treatment can make them more open to having that conversation. So what I would do is, like, you kind of want to know also who has control over the salaries at the company. Like in our company, it's like fully owned by HR. So your manager evaluates like what level of seniority you should be at, but then the actual salaries are built by HR. So kind of get to know like what it's like in your company. In some companies, it's really driven by the manager. They have bands, but then they can do whatever they want within those bands. Get into a conversation with like whoever's in charge of salaries. I'd say in most cases, it's going to be your manager that you're going to want to go to. And then approach them by saying like, so I found out that, like, maybe don't give the name of the person, depends on how transparent it all is, but that person is making much more than me. So I wanted to have that conversation. I was curious as to why. I haven't noticed a huge difference in seniority or performance between that person and me. So maybe I'm missing something and I just wanted to get your opinion on it. And then based on the answer of that person, you're really gonna get to see, do they have a good justification ready? in terms of, yes, that person is actually much more senior, they have more years of experience, or blah, blah, blah. Or you're going to see them crumble, basically. And at this point, they've already showed that, like, yes, we messed up, and now you know, and you don't know how to fix it. And then you can get into the conversation like, okay, so can we fix it now? Now that we know, can we fix it? Yeah, that's what I would recommend doing. It's always going to be uncomfortable no matter what.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So there was another question, which was, how would you suggest negotiating in the situation where I'm a mid-senior developer, but I use different technologies than the ones I want to work in the position I'm applying for? Ideally, I wouldn't like to pay to take a pay cut just to have a chance to work with more interesting technologies. I think that more and more companies are quite open. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but when we write job posts, we try to make it as open as we can in terms of what technologies the candidates have, and we try to more assess how quickly they can ramp up on the technologies. And for us, for instance, at Unito, if someone applies for a backend role, but they don't have the specific technologies as we do have, we will assess them like based on the language they know, and hope that they will ramp up fast and help them grow at the same level. So it shouldn't be for me a real concern. And I don't think you should cut your expectations here. I think you should, yeah, and if you do, just make sure that you are reassessed quite fast once you've got the time to onboard, and to be sure that you're quickly reassessed, because it doesn't make sense for you to take a pay cut just because it's a different technology. We believe that you should learn quite fast. Sarah, I don't know if you want to complete here my answer.
I think we have a bunch of questions. I've just discovered the Q&A feature, by the way. I was like, where are you getting all these questions from? I see one from Andy, who has experience outside of Canada, but since she's been in Canada, has been only getting offers that don't seem to take into account those years of experience that she has in other countries. So to that, I'd say my first advice would be to do exactly what you're doing today, which means like get a network going, meet some other people in the same role as you here in Canada, and ask them like, what do you think? Does that make sense to you? Do you think I'm junior? Like, am I missing something? Is it like different criteria in Canada versus where I come from, etc. So that you can have that confidence then. If everyone tells you like, no, you're right, you're really more of an intermediate, so that's really the job you should be asking for, then you have that confidence when you go back to your interview process to say like, listen, I don't think I'm junior at this point, I have these years of experience, so I wouldn't take an offer for a junior role, I'm only going to take an offer for an intermediate role. I think it's really important. Like one of the things, doing your research is great to like have accurate information, but it's also really great to give you the confidence to then go in and ask for what you know you should get. So that's what I recommend doing. It could be just because you've interviewed with the wrong companies too, that are not willing to treat you fairly and that only judge Canadian experience, which sounds really, especially in the tech industry, really stupid, to be honest. So yeah.
In terms of education, because that was a follow-up of the question, I feel that in Canada, they are more open-minded than in other countries about what's the education you have. And that's my gut feeling from the different people I've been talking to, but I've seen a lot of people doing career switch. And at Unito, we hired people who started in the music industry, who already had like a first few experience as developers, but I feel that they had a chance to start their career. So I would think that it's more open-minded than in other countries like France, where they're still like looking at specific schools and things like that. So I just find the right company, I would say. On the framework, the other question was, do you recommend any framework to help set up school so that you can talk with your managers? I'm going to let you answer, Sarah, because you're the one who built all the frameworks, and I'm sure that there are lots of resources that you'll be happy to share.
Yeah, so the one we use internally, it's not shared publicly right now. It's stuff that I want to share in the future. So keep checking us out, I guess. Eventually they're going to be public. But the basics of it, we have like templates for growth plans. They're not very complicated. It's really like have an overarching goal. It could be, for example, I don't know, become a senior member of the team. I mean, that's very vague, but that could be your overarching goal. And then have like some sub goals that are going to help you achieve this that you build with your manager. The goal can be like, for example, I don't know, learn a new programming language. And then I always add a part that like if your company doesn't do that, I recommend like you add it for yourself, like with your manager, where it's like, how does this help your team or your company or the company to really show that you learning the skill is not just for yourself, but it's also going to positively impact the company or the team that you're part of. And then decompose that like sub goal into like concrete things that you're going to be doing. So it could be activities like, I don't know, I'm going to take that training, and then that can be a good way to negotiate, like having the company pay for the training, for example. It can be like, I'm going to take on that project, and here's going to be the metrics for it to be considered a success. So yeah, you have your goal, you have how it's going to impact the company or the team, and then you break it down into like concrete activities and metrics for how success of those activities is going to be determined. What else do we have? Is it
correct to come with another job offer to the manager to increase salary? I think it's definitely correct, but it's the last thing you should do. Like try all of the other tips before, and if there is no other way to negotiate because the person in front of you is not open to negotiation, that's when you need to take this step to have another job offer to negotiate things. It can be salary, but also other things that you're trying to get.
If you're doing that during a hiring process, it's like completely fair. Feel free to go for it. Like we said, yeah, if you're doing that with your current employer, be careful. You can gauge also what the culture of the company is. If you hear like that a bunch of other people around you at the company are doing that, maybe the company is very used to dealing with that, and so they won't react in a bad way. If you haven't heard of anyone doing that in your company, maybe like be a little bit more careful. Make sure like you're very clear on the fact that you like feel like you deserve a salary increase at this point. You've asked for it several times. You've been told no, and this is a problem for you. And then at that point, if you come in with another offer, it's like, listen, I've been clear on this. We've been discussing that for like a year now. I'm not happy with my current salary, and so I'm sorry to say that I went out to get another offer, and like I thought, it's higher than what you're currently paying me. That being said, really love this company, would love to stay there, really love working with your manager. So it would be awesome if you could match that offer, and then like we can continue that journey happily together.
Another question, which was about recruiters who tend to ask about current salaries instead of expectations. You should know that it's illegal in many countries to do so. For instance, in the US, there is a law which is protecting candidates, and no one should ask you for your current salary, but just for your expectations. I think it's getting more and more as a best practice for recruiters. So hopefully we're going to get only to the expectations. But if someone asks you about what's your current salary, and I would just recommend to answer my salary expectations are, and then you give why you've done the research instead of going on your current number. I don't think you should share it unless they really insist, but it's going to be a flag for you on why they want this. And if they then don't match your expectations, it's for me a really big flag. Then there is another question on how I should go about getting hired in Canada. I'm currently working as an app developer at IBM, but for a US client. How to get my visa sponsored for an Indian citizen. I'm not an expert in immigration, so I won't be able to answer. I don't know, Sarah, if you've got any tips here.
I don't want to give immigration advice. I do know a bit about it, but just to make sure you get the right information, There's a cool organization that's called Montreal International that does exactly that, gives immigration advice to people in your situation. So I recommend finding these kinds of organizations and yeah, getting their advice. And another thing that you can consider doing if you, I mean, no, you're saying it's a US client. So if your company doesn't have a branch in Canada, yeah, I guess you can't go to them. But yeah, if your company does have a branch in both countries, you can always go to your company and see if you can do an international move sponsored by them. That's always a good way to do it.
Did we miss any questions?
I do believe we went over all the questions. If anyone still has questions, please feel free to drop them either on the Q&A or in the chat if you haven't figured out the Q&A section. But it's on the bottom right, and then it's a little triangle and square and circle.
No, it seems like I'm the only clueless person here. So
Okay.
I would have a question for you, and it's more about you know, how you do things at Unito. I'm curious why you decided. I mean, you kind of gave us a flavor of why, but was it like this since you started, or was it a shift during your journey?
So like I think one of the huge portion of how things are different at Unito is salary transparency, right? It kind of all stems from there, and that was present from like day one. When our CEO founded the company and him and his co-founders decided to hire the first employees, at that point, it was already transparent. So it all started like super early on. I don't know what it's like to do the switch from no transparency to transparency. Other companies do though, but they'll have better advice for doing that. But yeah, so salary transparency started, and then, well, for a long time, there wasn't any staff dedicated to kind of building a whole bunch of processes around employee growth and stuff, although our CEO was always very kind of naturally good at it and conscious of it. But yeah, as we grew the team and adding people in like the team we call employee success, then we started building more and more things around that. So building up the whole salary transparency, having like a great methodology to figure out which salaries we should pay, readjusting for women-dominated roles, doing the whole growth path. So it kind of, you have to go at it one by one, look at like what seems to be a priority, and then attack this and then move on to the next step. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually wondering if it was a shift, and if it was, if you could speak about it.
Yeah,
but I do understand that it's more challenging to like readjust everyone's.
it is more challenging. If any of you are looking to create your own company, start with this from the get-go. Don't start building like super complicated growth paths for people from day one. That's like way too much time investment for like super early entrepreneur. But the salary transparency, it's actually going to be easier for you to do it from the start than to switch afterwards, or to try and hide everyone's salaries when you're a team of 5 where everyone's super friends.
Absolutely. We do have another question now. So it's, do you have any advice on how to approach a counteroffer from your current employer? Would it be okay to negotiate the new offer with that counteroffer?
Yeah, I think it would be okay to negotiate with the company making you the offer. My only advice here would be really go back to your criteria and reassess both, because sometimes you want to make the move and it's like make sure that you're doing the right move by going not following only the money because it's something, but making sure that what frustrated you, if it's only the money, like check a few boxes before doing the move, because there are some stats showing that people getting a counter offer will still leave within the next 6 months, because there are other things that are frustrating us. So it's a famous stat. I don't have the exact number, but I think it's after 6 months staying in their current company, getting a counter offer, most of them are going to still leave. So I would just advise you to go back to your criteria and go through them and make sure that you're making the right move. But it's totally okay to go and tell the company, hey, we got a counter offer. Can you match it? at Unito it wouldn't work because we can't make a counteroffer because it wouldn't be fair as everything is transparent, but most of the companies should be able to readapt and like align, or if they can't, then be able to justify why.